And welcome to the second part of this little series in our Restless Royals. Now we've left the Anglo-Saxon and Saxon period behind, and we are going into the medieval period with King Henry III here. Henry III was medieval England's longest reigning and most pious king, also known as Henry of Winchester, because at the time the title of Prince of Wales did not exist. Even dukes didn't exist at this time. It would be another 100 years before the country saw dukes. So there was no title of Prince of Wales, so Henry, before he became king, was known as Henry of Winchester. Henry here, his own son, King Edward I, when he was theoretically what we would call Prince of Wales, he was simply known as the Lord Edward. Henry was born on the 1st of October 1207 in Winchester Castle, and was born into the mayhem and turmoil and the reign of one of England's worst kings, his father, King John, the Magna Carta King. And here we see him here. Henry's earliest years were spent with his wet nurse, Ellen Dunn. There are no images of her, of course. When Henry became king, he provided his old nurse Ellen with an ample pension. Now, I really can't express the level of angst and ill feeling in the realm that Henry grew up in. Warring barons, a father who was then and still is viewed as one of the worst kings this country has ever known. Here we see Magna Carta, which occurred in the reign of Henry's father. 1216 was a very bad year for England, and saw the only successful invasion of England by the French under Prince Louis, later King Louis VIII of France, which occurred on the 21st of May 1216, and for which Louis was excommunicated by a papal legate on the 29th of May. Henry's father, King John, died in October 1216, some say poisoned by monks, to rid England of an evil and tyrannical monster, which John was. That's why Magna Carta came about, because that king was such a piece of shit, basically. He was horrible. So, Henry ascended to the throne at the age of 9 in the year 1216, a boy king, which of course would entail a regency. First for 3 years, under one of England's greatest soldier statesmen of his day, William Marshall, whose grave we saw at Temple Church when I visited, if you watched my tour videos of Temple Church. William Marshall died in 1219 though, leaving Henry in England at the mercy of the barons. It was not pretty. It was in Henry's reign that we get the reforms and provisions of Oxford, which to cut a long story short, set us and our country onto the kind of government that we have today, with a proper parliament. The word parliament gets its name from the Normandy French parler, meaning to talk or meeting place. The medieval monk Matthew Paris, who we're seeing here, gives us some of the best accounts of Henry and a little of his personality. Henry's piety and pilgrimages, he gave charity to upwards of 500 people a day while on pilgrimage to Walsingham in the 1240s. He was also known for his charity towards orphans and hospitals. Matthew Paris tells us that the king was quite scholarly, and that his favourite reading material was a great book of romances it had given him from one of his Norman family members. The courtly love and romance of the jongleurs and the Norman court was admired throughout Europe at this time. And remember that our medieval kings were Normans or of Norman descent, and still at this time had close family and marriage ties to that country. So, as Matthew Paris, who we see a self-portrait of here, in his manuscript Historia Anglorum, and that is a really good book if you can go through the translations of it. It's a bit heavy, but some good history in that, from the reign of Henry III to Edward I. So here is Matthew Paris. I have no idea what he's doing, so there we are. But Matthew Paris and Henry's people noted, this is why Henry was so loved, he was noted for his piety and kindness towards his own people, which leads us on to one of the most shameful stains on English history, in my opinion. He wasn't so kind and pious towards his Jewish subjects, though. In Henry's reign, the laws of Jewry were brought in. Jews in the end were made to live in ghettos and were forced to wear yellow stars. In the end, a place called the Domus Conversorum, which is the Jewish House of Conversion. The building was in Chancery Lane, which is what we're seeing here, was set up. And basically, it was set up in place to bring about the conversions of Jews from the Hebraic faith to the Roman Catholic faith. And that's what we've just seen. And the yellow star here, I'll go back to, this is an example from the Second World War that Hitler made the Jews wear, and it's pretty obvious where Hitler got his idea from, isn't it? Because the Jews were made to wear these in medieval England. As I say, this king was noted for his piety towards his own Christian people, but not towards his Jewish subjects, not at all, sadly. As I say, not towards his Jewish ones. There were several pogroms against the Jews in his reign that would only get much worse in the reign of his son, King Edward I, Old Longshanks, who we've already seen, when England experienced its own kind of Holocaust, eventually leading to the expulsion of the Jews in the year 1290. And this is the disgusting bit. Only after every rotten bastard, including the kings themselves, had lent every single penny they could from the Jews, remembering at the time that Catholics, because of their religion, couldn't lend money because of the sin of usury, and Jews could. So what these bastards did is lent every penny they could off these Jews, and then all of a sudden, once they'd lent every penny they could, the medieval Englanders remembered their so-called religious convictions and remembered that the Jews were Christ killers and branded them as such. The people they'd lived alongside and lent a lot of money off of. Thousands were killed and the rest were banished. One of the things that King Henry was most famous and respected for in his own time was in 1247, when he stabilised the country's poor and debased coinage with a recoinage and introduced the long cross penny for the first time in England. You'll see in the front of one here with the king with his crown and sceptre, and the back of it here, long cross penny. They brought the long cross out, one, so to sort out the debased coinage problem, and two, to try and sort out the problem of coin clipping, because the long cross went right to the edge with the two beads on it, and people would know straight away if it had been clipped, but it didn't stop the problem of coin clipping. As I said, King Henry III was one of medieval era's longest reigning kings, reigning for 56 years. Not a feared warrior king like his ancestor William the Conqueror, or his own son would become King Edward I, the future King Edward I, but noted for his charity to the poor, Christians, and noted for his piety, and especially his devotion to St Edward the Confessor. His greatest legacy was the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, which we're seeing a image reconstruction of King Henry III's Westminster Abbey, which is, he gave us the Westminster Abbey that we still know and love and enjoy today. Henry died on the 16th of November 1272 at the old Westminster Palace at the age of 65 years, which was quite a considerable age for the time, and it's believed that he may have died from a stroke. He was given a lavish funeral just 4 days afterwards. This is extremely speedy burial for the time. He had a magnificent funeral, and his body was temporarily buried in the old grave of St Edward the Confessor in the Abbey on the 20th of November 1272. Henry was the first monarch to be conveyed to his funeral and buried in a coffin, rather than the body being visible and carried on a bier, visible to all the public. The reason for this first coffining of an English monarch is not recorded. But that wasn't to be the end of King Henry, the end for King Henry's body. In the spirit of our restless royal corpses, he wouldn't be appearing in this otherwise, would he? Henry's corpse was to have two more adventures. The first one was 19 years after his initial burial, which had been in St Edward the Confessor's old grave, as we said. Then in the year 1291, his body was taken up and placed in this splendid tomb put up by his son, King Edward I, to the north of the shrine of St Edward the Confessor. But his heart was at this time taken out and delivered to the Abbess of Fontainebleau Abbey in France, burial place of some of his famous Norman ancestors, and this is what Henry had wished for his heart to be taken there. Remember what I said at this era about the entrail and heart burials. Then, the second and last invasion upon the King's royal rest came in November 1871, and we're seeing a drawing of that from this era, when his tomb was opened for the purpose of cleaning the monument. The Society of Antiquaries, led by the Dean of Westminster, conducted a thorough study of the tomb's materials and assembly. First, the Dean's party lifted away the heavy cast bronze effigy from the top, which it's very difficult for the public to see the effigy really well today, because the tomb, as we see it from where the public are allowed to go, is the north ambulatory, which is the back side of the tomb. Now, in this image, we're seeing the tomb from its front side, which is from within the chapel of St Edward the Confessor. Now, this is a very sacred area. One, because of the sacred element of what it is, and two, because it contains parts of the Cosmati pavement, which is very delicate. So hence one of the reasons why people aren't allowed in there that much. You can go on one of the Verger's tours, but one, you're not allowed to photograph, and two, you're most definitely not allowed to film. So we're seeing the tomb really from its front side, which we don't often get to see. You can see it from above in some of the upper galleries and that, but this is about the best view we're going to get of it. And as I say, when they lifted the effigy up, or took the effigy off, this is what they found underneath, which is really quite interesting. They found engraved into the stone the images of a queen and a nun kneeling in prayer in front of an unfinished male figure, which may well have been the king. The investigators then examined the two marble chests stacked below, each of which retain elements and fragments of the stone, glass and solid gold mosaics which had lent the tomb its original opulence since the time of its construction, but sadly much of which has been robbed away and pillaged over the years, particularly from the side that we will view the tomb from the north ambulatory side. But this is a fairly recent copyright-free image of the tomb from the front side in the chapel of St Edward, where we can't go, and as you can see, it is very opulent, the figure that lays on top the effigy. And this is interesting itself, which I'll mention now. There are no images of King Henry from his own time, other than on coins or the very unrealistic like images that you get from illuminated manuscripts and books of hours and things like that. But on top, the effigy, the face of that, when this tomb was set up, it was well noted by monks and scholars that the effigy of the king was rendered very lively and like unto his late majesty, which means that the face and the head really look like the king, probably done from a death mask or a wax effigy or something like that. So that's the nearest we'll ever get to seeing the true face of Henry III, and the opulence of the tomb, really, which we'll see some of when we'll get to that bit in a minute. But this is the front side of it, and notice the niches. These niches, it's believed that they retained relics before the dissolution of the monastery, and the relics that this tomb would have contained undoubtedly would have been relics of St Edward the Confessor, bearing in mind that this king here idolised St Edward the Confessor, as we've discussed, and had the whole abbey built around his tomb and tomb shrine. So the tomb and shrine area of St Edward the Confessor is the oldest area of the abbey, and this king had that all built around there. So the relics that would have been in this man's tomb were very, very likely those of St Edward the Confessor. But here's just a little of the opulence and beauty of the tomb, all inlaid with its glass and semi-precious stones and solid gold. And this is from the front side, which we can't get to, as I say. And it's been much pillaged and robbed over the years, particularly in the dissolution, and most particularly in Cromwell's time, Oliver Cromwell. Right, so the Very Reverend Arthur Penrhyn Stanley and his colleagues then proceeded to remove the lid of the upper tomb chest in order to see the coffin within, which contained the embalmed body of the king. This action concluded, the antiquarian studies, and Stanley recalls, a feeling was found to prevail that there did not seem, upon any historical grounds, to be sufficient motive to warrant the opening of the late king's inner wrappings and shrouds, although, he notes, they were exceptionally well preserved. It being well known of the Queen's disliking of such matters, that's Queen Victoria who we're seeing here. We're going to get onto another Restless Royals soon, maybe. Well, I don't know when I'll get around to it, but I will get around to it. But that covers the opening of the tomb that contained King Charles I, and when that was opened in the Georgian era, King George IV did not have any of Queen Victoria's reserve, and actually took bits off of King Charles I's dead body, such as a tooth and hair, and Queen Victoria was absolutely disgusted by this, and she later had those pieces reburied back in the grave. So to open King Henry's tomb in the first place, for the conservation, they would have had to get the Queen's permission. So the Queen's disliking of it being well known was the Queen that probably downright said to them, well, yes, you can open it, but do not be having any repeat experiences of the opening of the grave of Edward I or Charles I. So that's that. The coffin and outer tomb chest was then closed, but interest in this tomb amongst scholars and visitors to the Abbey still persists to this day. Because of what lies in there, it was never fully examined, and the tantalising, exceptionally well preserved thing that Arthur Penrhyn Stanley writes down, that tempts and tantalises people that would like to see another Edward I tomb opening situation. So what does lie in that tomb to this day? We know a body, of course, but another medieval mummy maybe, just waiting to be discovered. Now that's a thought, eh? Now, please join me in Westminster Abbey, where we'll see the final and lavish last resting place of this medieval king. And as I say, there are no images of him from his lifetime. This is a posthumous image, and the images that we see like this of the king are all taken from that tomb effigy. So this is a pretty good one. This is my favourite one. Now please join me in Westminster Abbey from the north ambulatory at the back side of the tomb, where we'll visit the last resting place of this king. Hi everyone, and we're in Westminster Abbey, and here you see the tomb of King Henry III. King Henry III basically rebuilt this abbey. The abbey that we see around us today was rebuilt by this king. And this is one of the few tombs that still has a lot of its original detail. As we'll discuss in the tomb of Edward I, our kings didn't always stay in the same place. Their bodies weren't always left alone. When Henry first died, being the rebuilder of this cathedral, he was buried in the original grave of St Edward the Confessor, because St Edward the Confessor was moved into the shrine that he is in now. And this king was buried in his grave, but his son, some 19 years after the funeral, he was moved into this tomb here. So and he reigned from the 28th of October 1216 to the 16th of November 1272, which is when he died. He came to the throne as a child, a boy king, and he had to have a regent, which was William Earl Marshal of Pembroke, which is a man that's buried in the Temple Church. So that's the elaborate tomb of King Henry. As we can see, it's still got a lot of its original detail left. That is real gold that you're looking at there. This cosmati and intaglio work is done in enamel, gold and semi-precious stones. The whole tomb would have been covered in this, richly coloured. It's original day. And on top of the tomb is a tomb effigy, and the wooden thing above the tomb is a canopy of estate. The greatest kings or the most respected were given the canopy of estate. The king's effigy is up there. So some pictures of that will follow at the end of the video. King Henry III was the son of King John I, or King John the Worst, as some unkindly call him, and he was the father of the great King Edward I. Some don't call him great, but there we are. It's a story for another time. So this is one of the most original tombs in the Abbey. This Abbey, as I say, as we see it, was built by this king to replace the Norman Abbey of Edward the Confessor. And the entire Abbey was built around the shrine of St Edward the Confessor, which is through here. Sorry. There. There you're seeing the great shrine to St Edward the Confessor there, around which this entire abbey was built. And as I say, King Henry there was originally buried in Edward the Confessor's original grave, and then he was moved 19 years later into this boxed tomb, and has, very much like Edward I, a stone coffin with a human torso shape in it carved out of a lid. So
well, we're not going to go into that.
Join me for the next one. And so that's our first 3 Restless royals covered. Edward I here. St Edward the Confessor, we'll be seeing more of that sapphire soon. And King Henry III, the man that idolised Edward the Confessor so much. Now, I can't take you back into the world of St Edward the Confessor. It's far too long ago, I'm afraid. But I can take you back into the world of these two men, father and son, Henry III and Edward I. We're literally going to be walking in their footsteps in the very buildings that they had built. So join me from St Thomas's Tower and the medieval royal palace in the Tower of London, where we will literally walk in the footsteps of Henry III and Edward I here. Join me there. Welcome to their world.
You are in St Thomas's Tower, built over 700 years ago for the warrior king Edward I. Much of the Tower of London's appearance today is due to Edward and his father, King Henry III. Together they expanded the fortress and created an impressive new palace within it. As you explore the medieval palace, you will see how it might have looked in the 1200s. You might even bump into one of its royal residents. First, let us introduce you to their stories. Edward and his father Henry were descendants of William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke who invaded England in 1066. Edward and Henry were two powerful men, but two very different rulers. Henry was just 9 years old when he became king. He inherited a kingdom in crisis. The country was at war. Many lords, or barons as they were known, were in rebellion over high taxes and royal demands. Rebellion continued into Henry's reign and he struggled to keep control. He took refuge here at the Tower during periods of unrest and civil war. Despite this, Henry managed to hold on to power and reigned for 56 years, longer than any other medieval king of England. He loved art and architecture and was very religious. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey into the magnificent church that stands today. Henry married Eleanor of Provence, and they enjoyed a long and happy life together. When Henry died, their firstborn son, Edward, inherited the throne. Edward was a very different type of king. He was tall and muscular, an advantage in war as his long arms meant greater reach with his sword. Unlike his father, he was strong and decisive, a warrior king. Edward used brutal action to win and keep power. He is often remembered as the Hammer of the Scots. In 1294, he stayed in these rooms while preparing for war. Edward also did much to reform the kingdom, setting up a long-lasting legal system and establishing a parliament that is still recognisable today. Edward married Eleanor of Castile when they were both teenagers. It was a political partnership and a successful marriage. When Eleanor died, aged 49, he was heartbroken. It was 9 years before Edward married again to Margaret of France. Kings and queens didn't stay at the Tower of London for long, as the royal court travelled around the country. However, castles were important symbols of royal power and wealth. William the Conqueror securely decided to build a tower to defend Edward and his father Henry spent a little time adding to and improving the fortress. Henry strengthened the tower, adding an outer stone wall, reinforced by 11 new towers, including the most
And it isn't very often that we can walk in the footsteps of our historical characters that feature in my videos, but in these suites of rooms we can walk in the footsteps of Henry III, Edward I and Edward III, their queens, their sons, their daughters and their court, who would have all occupied these rooms. If you were wealthy in those days, life could be comfortable to a degree, but even the wealth couldn't protect you, because even some of the medieval monarchs, their daughters and sons or loved ones died of the plague and things like that. This is a bed fit for a king, strung with ropes underneath that holds the mattress in place, and that's where we get the saying "night night, sleep tight" comes from. Because if your ropes weren't tightly strung, you wouldn't be sleeping very well. You'd have a saggy mattress or a mattress that sagged in the middle. And night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite it. That's from the bed bugs bit, because even the royal bed had bugs and fleas in it, and that can be borne out by the royal account books, which pays for for the royal flea catcher to rid the place of fleas and stuff. Yeah, it must have been nice, mustn't it? This is the private chapel. And that is the Lord's Prayer in Latin, said over and over again. And now we leave the royal bedchamber, which would have been a very private room, and we go into a more slightly public area, what would have been a very grand area nonetheless. Very impressive this bit is. And as I say, it isn't often that you can walk in the footsteps of people from so long ago, but in this case we are and can. And this replica throne will give you a representation of what the coronation chair would have originally looked like in all its pomp and glory, brightly coloured. Which the coronation chair, which looks a battered old thing now, bless it, but this is what it would have originally looked like. And under a canopy of estate, which could only be borne over a member of the royal family, your king would have greeted your king in those days, or queen, very, very humbly indeed. And this is another chapel here, and this one is very historically significant because the Tower tradition says that this is where King Henry VI was murdered while at prayer. Traitor's Gate, and that over there is the royal bedchamber, and that where we just were. So, yeah, this cuts round on itself, kind of thing. A murder in the chapel. So not only could you live opulently in your medieval royal apartments, you could also be murdered in your own private chapel while at prayer. If, of course, no one wanted to murder you and you survived the experience of not being murdered. Once you were sitting in your throne and you finished doing with your statecraft and business, you could come and sit by the fire. And this fire is recorded as burning a ton of wood every year to keep the royal posterior warm. So King Henry III, Edward I, Queens Eleanor, and the royal family and the court would have all sat and enjoyed time here. And it is a rare privilege to be able to walk in the footsteps of historical characters that are featuring in my videos, but particularly historical characters from so long ago. It's not often that you can walk in the footsteps or stand in the blood trail of such people. So we've dealt with all our statecraft and our business and whatnot. We have not been stabbed or had our head smashed in. Different accounts give both of those options as causes of death for King Henry VI. Some say that when his corpse was taken to the church, it started to bleed, and in those days their superstitious belief was that that was a sign that he'd been murdered. And then when the next king came along and felt guilty for what his father had done, oh, ouch, I'm aching, Henry was moved. So they'll go to bed for the night, and well, the rest is history, as we say. And that's us walked in the footsteps of some very, very historical characters. Hope you all found this one interesting, guys and girls. Thank you for watching. You think that those dry old bones that are in the tombs now would once have rested themselves in opulent beds like this? Whether you're a king or not, that's where we all end up. So that'll cheer you up for the weekend, won't it, on that refreshing and positive note? Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching.